The sun had long lost its mercy on that stretch of prairie. The land lay cracked and dry, the earth bleeding dust with every gust of wind, and a silence heavier than church bells hung over the horizon. A lone rider stumbled into view, though rider was too generous a word for what he was now. The man no longer had a horse, only a torn saddle slung over his shoulder and boots eaten by the road. His hat sagged low, shadowing a face marked by hunger, by sleepless nights under an uncaring sky, by years of loss that never seemed to end. He had once been a cowboy, proud and restless, with cattle to drive and wages to spend. But now he was nothing more than a struggling shadow of that life, each step threatening to betray him, each breath taken like it might be the last. He had been walking for days, maybe weeks, though time had blurred into a single endless stretch of horizon. The land here had no mercy for men like him, too poor to settle, too broken to start again. His last coin had been traded for a strip of jerky that hadn't lasted half a day, and the water in his canteen was a memory that haunted the hollow sound of the tin when shaken. And yet, though his body begged him to lay down in the dust and never rise, something deep within him whispered to keep moving. Perhaps it was stubbornness, perhaps it was madness, or perhaps it was the faint echo of hope, a hope he himself no longer believed in. It was in that state, half dead, half dreaming, that he first saw her. A figure at the edge of the horizon, working the barren land with the strength of 10 men. At first he thought it a mirage, some trick of the heat playing with his exhausted eyes. The figure was larger than any he had ever seen, towering above the crops and fence posts, her movement steady, deliberate, unstoppable. A woman. Yes, it was a woman, he realized with disbelief. Her back broad, shoulders squared, her hands gripping a plow as if it were nothing more than a twig. The earth yielded beneath her strength, and beside her, running awkwardly with hair catching the sunlight, was a little girl, no more than 7 or 8, her laughter faint but piercing through the dead silence of the prairie. He stopped walking. For the first time in days, his body froze not from exhaustion, but from awe and a tremor of fear. He had heard stories on the road, tales told in saloons when whiskey loosened tongues, about the widow who lived out here, away from townsfolk, away from men. They said she was larger than life, strong enough to carry a calf in one arm and crush a man's throat in the other. Some called her cursed, others called her blessed, but all agreed she was not a woman one sought out lightly. And yet, here he was, too weak to turn back, too desperate to walk away. His boots carried him forward, though each step felt like trespass into sacred ground. The giant widow noticed him before he could decide whether to speak. Her head turned slowly, her height making the motion seem like the bending of a tree in the wind. Her eyes found him, sharp, unflinching, studying him not as a man, but as one studies a broken animal that has wandered too close to the homestead. He tried to muster words, but his throat cracked, and only dust came out. He was nothing before her strength, a starving stray in the shadow of a monument. Then she spoke. Her voice was deep, steady, carrying across the empty land as if the earth itself wished to listen. "I need a husband," she said with neither shame nor hesitation. "And you. You need a daughter strong enough to survive." The cowboy blinked, certain he had misheard, certain the fever in his body had turned her words into madness. But the look in her eyes was sober, sharper than any blade. She meant every syllable. The little girl clung to her mother's leg, peering at him with wide, curious eyes, and in that instant he realized the widow was not merely speaking of want. She was speaking of necessity, hers, his, and that of the child who stared at him as if searching for an answer he did not yet have. He staggered closer, boots dragging through the dust, and tried to laugh, but the sound cracked into a cough. "Ma'am, I think you've mistaken me for a better man than I am," he rasped, his voice broken as his body. "I've got nothing. No land, no money, no horse. I'm no one's husband, and surely no one's father." His words fell weak in the heavy air, swallowed by the enormity of her presence. But the widow did not flinch. She stepped forward, towering, and the ground seemed smaller beneath her stride. Her shadow covered him entirely, and for a moment he felt as though he were standing before some ancient force rather than flesh and bone. She crouched, not to his level, for even crouched, she seemed to loom above him, but enough that her gaze met his directly. "I've seen enough of men to know what I need," she said. "And I can see you're broken. That means you've lost enough to understand what it takes to keep someone alive." Her words struck deeper than any bullet. He wanted to protest, to turn away, to say she was wrong. But the truth of her voice left no room for denial. He was broken. And perhaps that was all he had left to offer. The child peeked at him again, timid, her small hand gripping her mother's apron. She had his eyes locked in place, innocent yet demanding, fragile yet expectant. In her gaze he saw something he had not felt in years, the weight of responsibility, the terrifying thought that maybe, just maybe, he was needed after all. The wind howled, kicking up dust between them, carrying the silence like a prayer. For a long time, no one moved. The widow waited, her expression unreadable, her strength unshaken. The cowboy stood trembling, torn between running from the impossible and stepping into the unknown. And in that suspended moment, he realized the road had brought him here for a reason. Not to die, not to surrender, but to face a choice that could either destroy him further or make him something greater than he had ever been. The giant widow did not wait for him to answer right there in the dust. Instead, she turned her back with the certainty of someone who knew her words had already settled in his bones, and she began walking toward the farmhouse that rose behind her like a fortress against the endless sky. The little girl followed at her mother's heels, skipping lightly, as though the heaviness of the moment meant nothing to her. The cowboy stood still for a breath longer, unsure whether his legs would obey him, then found himself moving forward as if drawn into her orbit. The house loomed larger the closer he came. Built of thick timber and stone, it looked different from the cabins and shacks he'd seen scattered across the frontier. Everything about it seemed reinforced, not by a craftsman's hand, but by necessity. Walls higher, beams thicker, doors wider. It was a house not made for comfort, but for endurance, as though it had been built to withstand storms, raiders, and perhaps even time itself. It was her house, and it bore her presence in every nail and plank. When the widow reached the porch, she stooped slightly to pass through the doorway, and the cowboy understood why everything seemed oversized. The house had been shaped to fit her life. He hesitated at the threshold, the smell of wood smoke and baked bread drifting out to him. He hadn't smelled food in days. The widow glanced back, one eyebrow raised. "Are you coming, cowboy?" she asked evenly. "Or do you plan to let the wolves have you when the sun sets?" He swallowed hard and stepped inside. The interior was just as striking as the outside. The table in the main room was heavy oak, its legs thick as tree trunks, clearly reinforced so it wouldn't buckle beneath her weight. The chairs were larger, too, crafted with an odd sturdiness that looked almost unnatural to him. A fireplace burned slow in the corner, and above it hung the rifle of a man who was no longer alive. The late husband, he guessed, though the dust that clung to it suggested it hadn't been touched in years. The girl darted across the room, climbing into one of the oversized chairs, and watched the cowboy with open curiosity. Her smallness seemed even more pronounced in this house built for giants. She rested her chin on her folded arms and said softly, "Mama says we need someone who stays." The cowboy's throat tightened. He removed his hat out of respect, his hands trembling against the brim. I ain't sure I'm the man you're looking for, he said carefully, his voice still ragged from thirst. I've got no land to offer, no cattle, no name worth speaking. All I've got's a worn saddle and a trail of mistakes behind me. The widow moved closer, her steps measured, and when she finally spoke, her words carried not just strength but an edge of sorrow that revealed more than her eyes ever could. You think I'm asking for riches, for cattle and titles? No, she shook her head, dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. I buried the man who gave me all that. He lies under the ground out back and the soil grows weeds where wheat should have stood. I don't need gold, cowboy. I need a man who won't run. The statement hit him harder than any blow. His mind raced back to every time he had run. From debts, from fights, from promises he couldn't keep. Running was all he knew. Yet there was something about the way she said it, something about her steadiness that made him want, for the first time in years, not to run. He lowered his gaze. And what if I fail you? What if I can't give your girl the strength she deserves? The widow studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she reached out, placing her enormous hand on his shoulder. Her touch was firm, but not cruel, grounding him in a way he hadn't felt since childhood. Then you fail alongside us, but you'll fail standing, not running. My girl will learn that survival ain't about never falling. It's about getting back up. Silence thickened between them. The crackle of the fire filled the room, the child's breathing soft in the background. For the first time, the cowboy allowed himself to truly see the little girl, not as a burden or a stranger, but as someone whose entire life had been forged in hardship, someone who looked at him with an expectation that both terrified and anchored him. The widow stepped back, gesturing toward the table. Sit. Eat. On the table lay a loaf of bread, coarse but warm, and a pot of stew that filled the air with a scent so rich it nearly broke him. He hadn't tasted such a meal in years. His hand shook as he reached for a piece, tearing it carefully, as though afraid it might vanish. The girl giggled at his clumsy gratitude, and for a moment, a strange warmth filled the space between them. When his hunger eased and the firelight softened the edges of the night, the widow spoke again. This time slower, as though each word were weighed on scales. You can leave come morning if that's what you choose, but if you stay, you'll not just be my husband. You'll be a father, a protector, a man who stands when the storms come. Her gaze burned into him, leaving no room for misunderstanding. This was not romance she offered, it was survival, a pact carved in flesh and necessity. She needed him, and in some way, though he wouldn't yet admit it, he needed her too. The cowboy leaned back in the oversized chair, staring into the flames as the night wrapped around them. The fire snapped, the girl yawned and curled against her mother's side, and the widow waited with the patience of one who knew time would carve the answer from him. He sat there, torn between fear and longing, knowing dawn would force his decision, and as he listened to the fire and the quiet breaths of the child, one thought kept gnawing at him. Maybe for the first time in years, he had found a place where he wasn't just passing through. The hours dragged on inside the widow's house as though time itself had grown heavy. Outside, the prairie slept uneasy. Coyotes sang their hunger into the night. The wind rattled the boards of the barn, and every now and then a loose shutter clapped against the siding like a hand demanding entry. But within the thick timber walls, there was a silence that pressed on the cowboy's chest. A silence that no crackling fire seemed able to soften. He lay awake on a straw mattress in the small side room, staring at the ceiling beams. His body ached for rest, yet his mind wrestled with the storm the widow had planted in him with those strange, sharp words. I need a husband, and you need a daughter strong enough to survive. He turned over again and again, the coarse blanket twisting around him, his thoughts chasing each other in circles. What had she seen in him? A drifter with dust for coin and regrets for company. Why had she looked at him as though she already knew him, as though the ruin of his life was something she recognized? He was no husband. He was no father. He was nothing but a shadow dragging itself from one town to the next, chased by hunger and failure. And yet, her eyes. Those eyes had not asked. They had declared. And the little girl's gaze, so small, so fragile, yet filled with something that shook him more than gunfire ever had. It wasn't love. It wasn't even hope. It was expectation. The expectation of someone who had lived her entire young life knowing the world would try to break her, and who silently demanded the world give her just one person willing to stand beside her. The cowboy closed his eyes, but sleep brought him no peace. Memories crawled up from the dark. The face of his own mother, tired and sick, coughing in the corner of a one-room shack before the fever stole her breath. The shadow of his father, who had left with promises of wages and never returned, swallowed by war or whiskey. He never knew which. The long years after, drifting from cattle drives to border towns, always chasing coin, always running from debt or a gun barrel aimed his way. He had never belonged anywhere. He had never been anyone's anchor. He had never been asked to stand still, until now. The firelight from the main room spilled faint through the crack in the door, a pulsing glow that pulled him from the mattress. He rose quietly, his boots in his hands, and padded barefoot across the floorboards. The boards groaned beneath him, but he moved as though compelled by something larger than himself. She was there, as though she had been waiting for him. The widow sat by the fire, her broad shoulders cloaked in the glow, a knife in one hand, a whetstone in the other. With slow, steady strokes, she drew steel against stone, the sound ringing through the room like the whisper of fate itself. Her eyes flicked up as he entered, and for a moment, in that firelight, she looked like something carved out of legend, a figure larger than human, grief and strength bound into one form. "You can't sleep," she said, her voice steady, as if she had known his restlessness before he did. He leaned against the doorframe, shadows clinging to his hollowed face. A man don't sleep easy when he's asked to change the whole course of his life in a single breath. The knife paused. She set the whetstone aside and studied him. The silence stretched until the fire cracked, sending sparks into the chimney. Then she spoke. "I didn't ask for your life. I asked for your promise. Life changes on its own, whether you like it or not. But a promise." She tapped the knife against the wood of the table, sharp against the quiet. "A promise is something a man chooses." Her words struck him deeper than he expected. He stepped closer, his bare feet whispering against the wooden floor. "And what if I can't keep it? What if I'm not the man you think I am?" Her gaze didn't waver. She leaned forward, the fire painting her in red and shadow, her voice low but unyielding. "Then you die trying. That's all any of us can do. My husband died trying. He didn't live long enough to see her grow." Her eyes flicked toward the sleeping girl curled in a blanket near the hearth. "But he stood until the ground took him. That's all I ask. That's all she needs." The cowboy's throat tightened. He wanted to say he had nothing to give, that he was already dead inside, that he was a man hollowed by the road, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, he wanted, desperately, against all reason, to be the man she described. He lowered himself into the chair opposite her, the wood creaking beneath his weight though it was built to withstand far more. The fire popped, filling the silence between them. He stared at the flames, then at her, then at the child who dreamed softly in the corner. Finally, his voice broke the quiet, hoarse and heavy. "Then I'll stay. I'll stand. For you, for her." The widow's jaw clenched. but her eyes softened with something that could have been relief, or could have been nothing more than the release of a burden carried too long. Slowly, she reached across the table, her hand enormous, scarred, calloused, from years of toil. He hesitated, then placed his hand in hers. His was small against her grip, trembling. Hers closed around it like iron, like earth itself sealing over a grave. It was not a handshake. It was not affection. It was a pact. Carved, in silence, bound by necessity. The girl stirred in her sleep, murmuring, and the sound seemed to bless the moment. Something unseen shifted in the air, an understanding that whatever lay beyond the walls of that house, they would now face it not as three broken pieces, but as something whole. The widow released his hand and stood, towering. Then it's settled. At dawn, you'll not leave this place as a drifter. You'll leave it as my husband, and her father. Her words sank into him like stone dropped in a well, and though terror still gnawed at his chest, a strange, fragile thing bloomed within him too. Something he hadn't felt since he was a boy standing in the doorway of a home he barely remembered. Belonging. He sat in the glow of the fire, her words echoing in his head, knowing the world outside that door would never see him the same again. And as the night deepened, as the prairie sang its lonely songs, the cowboy understood that for the first time in his wandering life, he had made a choice, and there would be no running from it. The wind blew dry across the prairie that morning, carrying with it the scent of dust and unfulfilled promises. The ranch, which had once seemed only a refuge for two survivors broken by fate, had now become a stage for conspiracies and ghosts. The cowboy, still marked by his wandering life, felt for the first time as if he had something to lose. And it was precisely that certainty that consumed him. The knowledge that the world outside would leave neither the widow, nor her daughter, nor the home they were trying to build, in peace. In recent days, rumors had spread like wildfire through dry grass. In the nearest town, people spoke of men who would not accept the audacity of a giant widow, one who had declared publicly that she would choose a husband, take a companion, and raise a family with her own hands, without asking anyone for permission. To some, this was an affront. To others, an opportunity. Covetous eyes turned toward the fertile land of the ranch, and the marked cards of violence were quietly laid on the table. The daughter, growing stronger by the day, trained alongside the cowboy. He taught her to ride, to aim, to listen to the silence between the winds, to recognize when the branches of a tree moved not by chance, but by hidden hands. The girl, with eyes that blended innocence and fury, proved more perceptive than many grown women. The widow watched from a distance, her heart tight. Part of her feared that her daughter might become too hardened, shaped only to endure. But another part knew, in the West, either you hardened yourself or you disappeared. One afternoon, as the sun hid behind a wall of heavy clouds, the cowboy was hailed by two riders appearing on the horizon. Men with low hats, worn boots, and dark, penetrating eyes. They were not there to ask permission, but to deliver an ultimatum. "Tell the widow," growled the older of the two, "that neither her size nor your courage will prevent what's already written. This land will change hands, if not by gold, then by blood." The cowboy kept his face calm, but his hand resting on the revolver's grip trembled slightly. It was not fear. It was the restrained fury of someone who had lost everything once and would not allow fate to claim it again. "Tell your boss," he replied in a low voice like distant thunder. "This land has already been watered with tears. It will not be watered with cowardice." The men sneered and rode off, leaving behind only the dust of their threat. The cowboy stood still, feeling the invisible weight of the coming war. That night, The widow spoke as if her voice came from a deep cavern. They will come, and they will not come few. It has always been this way. It always will be. No man accepts a woman raising a home without bowing to their yoke. But I do not bow. I was not born to lower my head. The cowboy stepped closer, and for a moment, the world seemed suspended. We are not alone. As long as I breathe, they will not touch her, nor you, nor your daughter. The widow smiled in a strange way, somewhere between pride and pain. You speak as if death is an ally. Death has always been my companion, he said. But today, for the first time, I have someone to fight for. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant cry of the daughter, dreaming of storms of fire and faceless horses. The mother went to console her, and the cowboy sat on the doorway's threshold, stroking the dog that watched the ranch as if it too knew something approached. The following days were for preparation. Fences reinforced, ammunition counted, hiding places mapped. The widow, with firm hands, dug alongside the cowboy, raised barricades and sharpened knives. She was not a woman expecting rescue. She was a woman preparing the ground for war. And as she raised her immense figure against the red sky of sunset, the cowboy realized that together they had become something even the cruelest men feared. A home that could not be taken, a love born at the edge of a knife. And then came the moonless night. The howl of coyotes was the first sign, the distant creak of saddles the second. They were surrounded, mounted men, armed, ready to erase the ranch from the map. The cowboy breathed deeply, his heart beating like a war drum. The widow held the daughter to her chest, but her eyes did not tremble. The girl, clutching the small knife the cowboy had given her, whispered without realizing, "I am strong. I am strong enough to survive." When the first shot cut through the darkness, it was not only the sound of gunpowder that echoed, it was the scream of a family sworn not to surrender. The West that night would hear not only the violence of the invaders, but the fierce response of a marked cowboy and a giant widow who refused to bow to anyone. And so began the battle that would decide whether these lands would be watered with the blood of others, or whether the desert wind would once again carry away the bodies of those who dared defy the wrath of those who had nothing left to lose. The prairie was never truly silent, but that night it felt as if even the insects held their breath. The wind that usually whispered through the tall grass now carried only unease, rattling the wooden boards of the farmhouse like fingers tapping a coffin lid. Inside, the widow, her daughter, and the cowboy had lit no lamp, moving in the pale wash of moonlight that seeped through cracks and half-drawn curtains. Every sound mattered. Every shadow could be death. The girl clutched her mother's skirt, whispering, "Are they coming?" Her voice trembled, but her eyes, the same eyes that had stared defiantly at the cowboy weeks earlier, still glowed with stubborn courage. The widow knelt, cupping her daughter's face. "They are already here," she said, calm as steel, though her pulse thundered in her throat. She had lived long enough on the frontier to know, once men like Carver marked a family, they would not leave until blood had been spilled. The cowboy checked the rifle, running a calloused thumb over the chamber. He could hear faint hoofbeats, far out in the distance, echoing across the barren land. A rider gave a whistle, answered by another. Signals, a pack closing in. "They'll surround us," he muttered. "Then we don't give them the ground," the widow replied, her voice hardening. They barricaded the windows with furniture, chairs, planks, even the girl's small bed. The house became a fortress, fragile but determined. Outside, shadows moved. Men on horseback, the faint gleam of metal, Carver's gang. A voice rang out in the night, mocking, cruel. "Widow, cowboy, open that door before we turn this place into kindling." The cowboy raised his rifle and fired into the dark. A scream followed, cut short. The reply came at once. Gunfire cracking from all sides, bullets smashing against the wooden walls, sending splinters flying like shards of glass. The farmhouse groaned under the storm of violence. The girl screamed once, but quickly silenced herself, pressing her face into her mother's waist. The widow wrapped an arm around her, whispering, "Hush, my heart. Hush. Courage." Minutes bled into hours. Every lull in gunfire was filled with taunts and laughter from outside. Carvers, men circling like wolves. Inside, the smell of gunpowder thickened. The cowboy's hands blistered on the rifle, his shoulder bruised from recoil. The widow herself had taken up a pistol, her husband's old weapon, kept in a drawer for years. She fired with steady aim, each shot driven by a vow that no man would harm her child, but Carver was patient. He wanted not just their lives, but their surrender, their humiliation. He wanted to break them before killing them. And so he waited, letting fear gnaw at the edges of their strength. By dawn, the farmhouse looked less like a home and more like a grave already half dug. Windows shattered, door hanging by one hinge, walls peppered with holes. Inside, the cowboy slumped against a beam, chest heaving, face pale. His rifle was nearly dry, only a handful of cartridges remained. The widow counted her bullets, 5. The girl clung to her doll, the fabric stained with dust and blood from splinters. The widow knew what Carver was doing. He was starving them of hope. Soon, he would strike the final blow. And as the sun rose, painting the horizon blood red, a horn sounded from outside. Carver's voice bellowed, triumphant, "Last chance, widow. Give me the girl and I'll let the rest of you crawl away." The girl froze, eyes wide, and turned to her mother. The cowboy's hands trembled, rage and fear mixing in his stare. The widow stood, tall and unflinching, her shadow cast long across the ruined floorboards. She opened the door just enough for her voice to reach the men outside. "You will have nothing," she declared, each word sharp as a blade. "Not my daughter, not my home, not even the dust we stand on." Silence fell. Then came laughter, low, cruel, echoing across the prairie. Carver's horse stamped the ground, and his voice cut through the morning air like a death sentence. Then, "You'll all burn." A torch was lit. Another followed. Flames caught the dry grass around the farmhouse, curling upward, hungry and merciless. The siege had become a pyre. Inside, smoke began to seep through the cracks. The widow pulled her daughter close. The cowboy staggered to his feet, eyes blazing with desperate resolve. They were out of bullets, out of time, but not out of fight. And so, in the choking smoke and rising fire, the widow, the cowboy, and the child prepared to carve their final stand out of hell itself. The night smelled of rain, though no cloud dared to open above the valley. It was as if the heavens themselves held their breath, waiting to see what would unfold below. The moon was high, spilling silver over the black ridges, and the prairie seemed endless, a hollow stage where every shadow carried weight, and every silence carried threat. The widow stood at the edge of the canyon rim, her frame towering, her shawl fluttering in the wind like a banner of mourning. Beside her, the cowboy adjusted the worn strap of his revolver, his hand trembling not from fear, but from the memory of everything that had brought them here. Behind them, the girl, their daughter by blood of choice rather than birth, stood straight, her braids hanging heavy, her eyes sharp with the courage of someone who had grown faster than the years allowed. "They'll be here," the widow murmured, her voice calm, as though she were reciting a fact rather than predicting doom. The cowboy glanced at her profile, at the scar that ran from her cheekbone down her jaw, a mark left long ago by a world that never forgave strength in a woman. And when they come, it won't be like the others. This is the end." The girl looked from one to the other. "The end for who?" she asked. Her tone was not childish. There was no trace of innocence left to shatter. "For those who deserve it," the widow said, never breaking her stare at the horizon. "For us, if it has to be," the cowboy added softly. The first sound came, like thunder rolling over stone, hooves. Many. The canyon carried their echoes and multiplied them until the earth itself seemed to shake. The men who had hunted them for weeks were coming. These were not nameless marauders. They were the last remnants of power in this land, killers hired and bound by blood debt, men who carried not just guns, but the weight of old cruelty. "They'll come hard," the cowboy said. The widow's lips tightened into something between a smile and a grimace. "Let them. I've been waiting to bleed them dry since the day they set fire to my first home." The girl gripped the rifle she had carried. "Since the night they buried her mother," she whispered. "I won't run." "No," the widow said, turning at last to face her. "You'll stand. There's a difference." The riders poured over the rim like a black tide, torches burning, revolvers drawn. Their leader was a man, with a red scarf around his throat, a scarf already stained darker from years of slaughter. His laughter cracked through the air when he spotted the three figures standing against the pale moonlight. "Well," he bellowed, "the giant widow, the beggar cowboy, and their little bastard. Thought you'd slip away quiet, did you?" The cowboy's hand hovered over his revolver, steady now, his fear burned out of him. "We didn't slip," he said in a low growl. "We waited." And the gunfire began. The valley exploded in light and sound. Bullets shattered rock, dust flew like smoke, and the widow stepped forward as if her towering body alone could anchor the ground. She swung her shotgun like thunder, each blast tearing through the night, knocking men from their saddles, their screams ripped from their throats before they even hit the dirt. The cowboy fought lower, closer, revolver flashing, each shot precise, born of years of hunger, desperation, and the kind of patience only a broken man carries. He took bullets too, grazing his arm, tearing through his coat, but he stayed upright. And the girl, oh, the girl stood like a soldier of something ancient. She braced the rifle against her shoulder, eyes narrow, her breaths deep and calm. Each shot she fired was not just lead, but defiance. She missed sometimes, but when she hit with the weight of all her grief. They fought until the dirt turned black. The widow's shawl was shredded, her arm bleeding heavy, yet she pressed forward, dragging one outlaw off his horse with her bare hands, slamming him into the canyon wall. The cowboy's revolver clicked empty, so he drew his knife, steel flashing. As he cut through the chaos, the girl stumbled once, her rifle kicked from her hands, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to tilt. One of the men lunged for her, blade raised high, but the widow roared, a sound half human, half storm, and threw herself between. The knife cut deep into her side, but her hands crushed the man's throat until he went still. Blood poured hot down her dress, but she did not fall. Not yet. At last, only the leader remained. The man with the red scarf. He stood in the middle of the canyon, revolver drawn, chest heaving. Around him lay his men, silent now, shadows against the dirt. His laughter was gone. In its place was fury, desperate and shaking. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You think the world will let you live after this?" The cowboy stepped forward, revolver empty, knife dripping. His voice was quiet, but it carried like thunder. "The world doesn't get a say. Not tonight." The leader's hand twitched toward his revolver. But the shot didn't come from him, or from the cowboy. It came from behind. The girl, her face streaked with soot and tears, stood with her rifle leveled, smoke curling from the barrel. The leader staggered, a hole in his chest, the red scarf blooming darker still. He fell to his knees, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for breath before toppling into the dirt. Silence fell. The widow collapsed then, the strength finally leaving her body. The cowboy dropped to his knees beside her, his blood mixing with hers in the dirt. The girl fell too, clutching her hand, sobbing into her mother's shawl. The widow's breath came ragged, shallow. Her hand found the cowboy's, and then the girl's. She pressed them together. "You promised me," she whispered, voice fading. "Promised her." The cowboy swallowed hard, tears cutting through the grime on his face. "She'll never stand alone. Not while I breathe." The widow's eyes softened. For a moment, the scarred, towering woman looked almost gentle. "Good," she whispered, and then her eyes closed. The dawn came slow. Light spilled over the canyon walls, touching the dead, touching the dirt, touching the three who remained. The widow's body lay still, but her presence lingered in the silence, in the strength she had carved into both of them. The cowboy rose, weary but unbroken, and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "We ride on," he said softly. She looked up at him, her eyes red but fierce. "Together." And so they did. Two figures, father and daughter, not by blood but by vow, rode out of the canyon and into the rising sun. Behind them lay the ruin of violence. Ahead of them lay survival, carved from loss, bound by a promise made in the dark. And somewhere, in the whisper of the wind, the widow's voice lingered. "Stand."